Read me a book, Mom.
Hello, moms. I found this book, The Best Loved Doll, in our library when I was in grade school. It had the same drawings, illustration. It was so simple but so beautiful. And the story in itself was so beautiful that I always wanted to find a copy for myself. So when I finally did, bought it and I kept it for my daughters, and I've read it to them from infancy, and I've kept it to this day. That's more than 30 years ago. If you find a copy of this book, written by Rebecca Caudill, please buy it. It's well worth it. Come, let's read a book. The Best Loved Doll, written by Rebecca Caudill, illustrated by Elliot Gilbert. Come, let's read a book. It's entitled The Best Loved Doll. The four dolls waited quietly and listened. Melissa sat upright in her cradle. Belinda stood on the low bookshelf. Mary Jane sat beside her. Across Betsy's bed lay Jennifer. They had been waiting ever since Betsy went downstairs to breakfast. They had been waiting a long time. When the clock struck 8, they heard Betsy's father leaving for his office. When the clock struck 9, they heard Betsy's mother talking on the telephone. When the clock struck 10, they heard the postman coming up the walk. 5 minutes later, they heard feet running up the stairs fast. "Here she comes!" cried Jennifer. "Running like a rabbit!" whizzed Melissa. Into the room ran Betsy. In her hand she held a piece of pink paper. "Listen to this, dolls," said Betsy. "It's an invitation to a party at Susan Anderson's house." She read from the paper. "Bring one doll to my party this afternoon at 4. Prizes will be given for the oldest doll, the best dressed doll, the doll who can do the most things." Betsy stared at the invitation. "Bring one doll," she read again. She puckered her forehead. "Which doll shall I take?" she asked. She looked at Melissa. "The oldest doll." She looked at Belinda. "The best dressed doll." She looked at Mary Jane. "The doll who can do the most things." Then she looked at Jennifer. "Jennifer," she said. "Betsy," called her mother. "Coming," called Betsy, and down the stairs she ran. Once more the room was quiet. "A party," sighed Belinda. "I wonder what you do at a party." "You play games," said Mary Jane. "Remember when Betsy came home from the last party, she hid us all in the closet and found us again?" "Hide and seek was the name of that game," said Melissa. "You eat cake at parties," said Mary Jane. "Remember Betsy brought us a pinch of cake from the last party, wrapped in a pink paper napkin?" "You eat candy too," said Jennifer. "Betsy's fingers were sticky with candy when she came home from the last party. My hair is still a little sticky where she brushed her hands across it." "Sometimes you get a present," said Melissa. "Remember the time Betsy brought home that little red dog that lies on the shelf in the closet?" Melissa shuddered. "I never liked dogs," she said. "You do have beautiful clothes, Belinda," said Jennifer. "Betsy ought to make a new dress for you, Jennifer," said Belinda. "That dress you're wearing is a fright." Jennifer's dress was blue with white dots. It was the only dress she had ever had. She had worn it all her life. It was faded and rumpled. "I guess it is a fright," said Jennifer, smiling. "I hadn't thought about it before." "My hearing's not good lately," complained Melissa. "But I thought I heard Betsy read, 'Bring your oldest doll.' If Betsy wants to win a prize, she'll take me to the party. I'm 100 years old. I belong to Betsy's great-great-grandmother." My, you really are old, Melissa," said Jennifer. I'm only 5. Pardon me for saying so, Jennifer dear, wheezed Melissa. But you look to be 500. Jennifer smiled. That's because I played so hard all my life, she said. Jennifer lay across Betsy's bed trying to think of something she could do. She smiled at Mary Jane. You do smile prettily, Jennifer, Mary Jane told her. It's too bad you can do nothing else. You're forgetting, said Mary Jane, that the invitation said, bring the doll who can do the most things. If Betsy wants to win a prize, she'll take me. What other doll can do the things I do? Tell me? The dolls heard footsteps on the stairs. Here she comes, cried Jennifer. Betsy hurried into the room. She stood looking at Melissa, at Belinda, and at Mary Jane. She puckered her forehead. Pointing with her finger, she counted out, Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a feeny, finy foe. If he hollers, let him go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. She pointed last at Belinda. Betsy took Belinda carefully from the shelf. She turned her around and looked at her beautiful clothes. Belinda, tall and proud, stood on her little heart-shaped mirror. She wore a bride's dress of heavy white taffeta. Her skirt ended in a long train. On her black hair, she wore a long white veil. Tiny white flowers held her veil in place, and in her white gloved hands she carried a bouquet of white roses. Tiny white shoes were fitted on her feet, lace trimmed with her white underthings, and every tuck and hem stitch had been made by careful hands. You are beautiful, Belinda, said Betsy, as she stood the doll on the shelf once more. She walked across the room to her bed, where Jennifer carelessly lay. I wish Susan was giving a prize for dolls like you, Jennifer, she said. Jennifer smiled at her. Again, Betsy stood looking at Melissa, Belinda, and Mary Jane, and then she counted out. Engine, engine number 9, running on Chicago line. If she's polished, she will shine. Engine, engine number 9. She pointed last at Melissa. She stood a minute looking at the oldest doll. Melissa was made of wood. In spite of her age, her eyes shone brightly, and her cheeks were apple red. Her hair, still golden but wispy with age, fell about her sharp shoulders. She wore a filmy white dress that was tied about the neck with a blue ribbon. She sat propped against little pillows in the cradle as old as she. A patchwork quilt covered her from the waist down. At last, Betsy turned from the cradle. She walked to the bed where Jennifer lay and stood looking at her. Then she shook her head sadly. Jennifer smiled at her. Again, Betsy looked at Melissa, Belinda, and Mary Jane. Again, she counted out. Entry, country, country corn, apple seed and apple thorn, wire, briar, limber, lock, 3 geese in a flock, 1 flew east and 1 flew west, and 1 flew over the cuckoo's nest. She pointed at last to Mary Jane. Mary Jane was seated at the sewing machine. She wore a blue dress with a long full skirt and long sleeves. About her neck, she wore a black ribbon tied in a bow at her throat. Betsy turned the key in Mary Jane's back. At once, Mary Jane's little feet began to work the treadle, and the sewing machine began to sew. Mary Jane leaned forward and watched the stitches. Then she raised herself from her chair, took the cloth in her hands, looked at it, and put it back in the machine again. As she sat down, Her feet began to work the treadle, and the sewing machine began to sew, over and over. "Are you making Jennifer a dress, Mary Jane?" asked Betsy. Mary Jane took the cloth in her hands, looked at it slowly as the key in her back unwound. Jennifer smiled. Betsy crossed the room to her bed. She lifted Jennifer from the bed and looked at her. Jennifer's wig was loose, and her hair was tangled. Her nose was cracked. When Betsy tilted her, her left eye closed, but her right eye stayed open. Her cheeks were patched with adhesive tape. Her white stockings and her black patent leather slippers had been lost long ago, and her feet were bare. The toes on both her feet were worn away, and her knees were scarred. But on her face, she wore a smile that never went away. "You aren't my oldest doll, Jennifer," said Betsy. "Your dress is a fright, and you can't do a single thing. But I do love you, dear Jennifer." She carefully laid Jennifer back on the bed. For a minute she stood looking at her. She puckered her forehead. Suddenly she snatched Jennifer from the bed and rushed out of the room.